There is now the opportunity to react and comment.
I wanted to ask Professor Polkinghorne and the other speaker as well, whether he's a Copenhagenist and or an anti-realist, and what do you see as their connection?
Well, certainly, I mean, from quantum theory, we certainly learn that the world is not naively objective. That was what upset Einstein, and that's why though he'd been the grandfather of quantum theory, he hated his grandchild. The critical point, I think, is the following. Nick has been talking about some intrinsic unpredictabilities present in physical processes, and undoubtedly that's correct. Now, that's an epistemological statement. That's a statement that we cannot know what the future behavior is going to be. And it is a metaphysical decision about how you interpret that, how you move from epistemology, what we know, what we can't know, to ontology, what is actually the case. And there are philosophical room for maneuver in doing that. For example, go back to quantum theory for a minute. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is an epistemological principle. It says you cannot measure both position and momentum with arbitrary accuracy. Almost all quantum theorists believe that means that they are actually intrinsically indeterminate. So that the reality of the quantum world is veiled in an idiosyncratic way. But there is another interpretation of quantum theory due to David Bohm, which says that the quantum world is actually purely deterministic, but we do not have access to all the factors that determine exactly what's going to happen. And you cannot distinguish experimentally between those two interpretations. They have the same experimental consequences. So the choice between them is a metaphysical choice rather than a physical choice. Similarly, the question of unpredictabilities in the brain, does that represent intrinsic, an intrinsic openness to the future? Now, we're not saying, of course, that we're not moving away from the principle of sufficient reason. Something brings about the future. But if the physical interactions of the neurons in the brain aren't the whole story, there is then room for the operation of other causal principles, like, for example, my free choice to raise my arm.
I would just add that there's an intriguing paper by John Conway, which is referenced in the book, which does put very tight bounds on the Bohm interpretation. I think it's a really ingenious and very difficult mathematical experiment. And so that may help to distinguish between the two, but it's too early to be sure.
Thank you both very much. Nicholas said that materialism was limited right at the beginning. My question is, why is God so small? The belief in God, I have no problem in understanding that belief and science can exist together, and they address different questions and relate to different parts of what we think and feel. But people who believe in God, whatever the religion is, God seems focused on such trivia. Why is he so bothered about sex and what we wear and strange ceremonies, which seem to me very small matters?
I think it's quite difficult, if you take evolutionary biology seriously, to take the view that sex is a small matter.
And for other reasons.
In the end, I don't think for one moment that evolution tells the whole story of life, but it tells a very important aspect of the story of life. And therefore, the choice of, who mates with who, what offspring are produced, how they're nurtured, and so on and so forth, is actually completely fundamental to any society, whether human or otherwise. And so I guess it's kind of understandable that if God cares about humans and loves us, as we believe God does, then God will be concerned about what is really, in some sense, biologically, scientifically, the most fundamental and important single aspect of human life. I don't think it's the only thing, but it's certainly extraordinarily important. I'm not quite sure whether God's terribly worried about clothes, except insofar as it affects interpersonal relations, because ultimately, from the theological point of view where we come from, the most fundamental thing is love. So love is about how you treat people, how you relate to people. It's got a lot to do with the extent to which you respect their autonomy and their dignity. But as John was saying, all wise theologians, without exception, are emphatic that everything they say or understand about God is only beginning to sort of skim the surface, that there is far, 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 far more to God than anything that humans can say. Now, we don't always live up to that, but that's just because humans are feeble. But intellectually, all reasonable theologians are committed to that.
Yeah, I mean, all religious traditions have got tied up on what seem to be trivia from time to time. There's no doubt about that. And Jesus made the point to the Pharisees when he said tithing, mint and cumin wasn't really what it was all about. But when you thought about God being small, I thought that you might think about God's limited action. It seems to me that God is not limited from the outside, but God is certainly internally limited. When we say that God's almighty, it doesn't mean that God could do absolutely anything. The rational God cannot decree that 2 + 2 = 5. Though I think Descartes thought he could, but I don't think that's right. Similarly, the God who is the God of love cannot be a sort of cosmic tyrant who has a tight control over all of creation. He must be a God who takes the risk of there being free-willing creatures who are allowed to be themselves and indeed to make themselves. So there are internal restrictions. God can't, the medievals who used to discuss so much, God cannot produce a stone too heavy for God to lift.